Hello, I'm Nathan, and this is the 5th episode of the 2020 Teen Summer Writing Workshop. Wow, you've made it this far and you've done a ton of work. Now we're looking at putting the final task for you to complete in front of you. By now, you should be done with your second draft. That means that the next step is to show it to someone and start getting some feedback so you can figure out what is and isn't working before you start to craft that final draft. This process is called the critique. I know in much of the world, being a critic has a negative connotation, but that isn't necessarily the case for writers. Writers rely on the critique process to ensure that they're putting their best work in front of their readers. In this episode, we're going to cover two portions of this process: preparing to give a critique and what to do with the feedback you receive. This is the part of the video that I want you to make sure whoever is going to help you critique your work watches. So if they aren't with you, or if you're doing this over the web, make sure that they watch this prior to giving them that copy of your second draft. Okay, are you ready? Great. Everything I'm going to cover in this section can be found on pages 60 and 61 in the workbook. If you don't have a copy yet, you can follow the link below. Writers can be very sensitive about their work. They've spent a lot of time and effort to get to the point where they have something to show you. They're presenting a very personal creation to you, and that takes trust. Parts that you think don't make sense usually make perfect sense to them because the creation came out of their head. It's because of these tendencies that they're seeking your feedback. So when you're helping a writer through this process, what's your job? Your job is to help the writer make the best possible piece they can. With that in mind, there's a few things that you need to consider. First, don't compare the writer's work to your own. You're two different people with two different stories to tell. Their story isn't your story, it's theirs. So help them make their story the best that they can make it. Remember, this isn't the final thing yet. You're helping that writer get closer to the finish line. Next, you need to approach this process as a reader. It's important for you to let the writer know how a reader experiences their work. This includes what a reader thinks and what a reader feels as they go through the story. Everything you're bringing to the writer's attention should be from the perspective of a reader. For this early draft, you shouldn't be focused on spelling, punctuation, and grammar. You should be focused on the structure and if the feeling of the story works first, and then you can help with that other stuff. You need to let the writer know if their narrative arc is taking you someplace, if the voice and tone work, and if the literary techniques they're using are helping to accomplish their goals. You need to present your feedback in a caring and supportive manner. Remember, we're trying to help the writer create the best thing they can, and they won't do that if you communicate in a manner that causes them to block out your feedback. Being caring and supportive doesn't mean shying away from addressing glaring flaws in their work. It means communicating with the correct intentions. Using phrases like, "I think the reader will," instead of "I think you should," helps to frame the feedback from the appropriate perspective, the readers. Don't be afraid to ask questions of the writer. Understanding what they're trying to accomplish can help you give more informed feedback and directly address their concerns. If they're missing their intended effect, point out that they're missing it. This is often received more favorably than commenting about the failure of their techniques. It also helps the writer think about how they could accomplish their intended effect differently. Make sure you discuss the emotional responses you're having as a reader as you move through what the writer wrote. Talking about these shifts will help the writer understand if what they're doing is successful. Talk about what works and what doesn't. It's easy for us to focus on things that don't work, but even the roughest of drafts have some gems. Recognizing what the writer has done well is important in helping them to understand that you're working to help them create the best possible piece. Finally, remember that the writer has the final say. Your name as the person who is providing the critique isn't going to be on that byline. You don't own this work, the writer does. You can give great feedback that the writer decides not to use. That doesn't mean that they didn't think about it and that it didn't help them move through the process. Remember, you aren't the only reader out there, and just because something didn't work for you doesn't mean that it won't work for someone else. That's why writers should have more than one person reviewing their work. Okay, that's all the things I have to say for the person who is going to give the critique. Now on to what to do with their feedback. If you're following along, this is going to be the stuff that starts on page 68 in the workbook. As a writer, you are tasked with making the decision about how to address the concerns of the individuals who helped you with your critiques. Hopefully you had some good conversations and got some great feedback from at least 2 people. Once I've received all that feedback, I look for things that multiple reviewers are commenting on. If multiple people are saying the same thing, that likely requires attention from me as the writer. Sometimes your reviewers will have differing opinions about the same sections. One may love it, and one may find that it doesn't work for them yet. As a writer, you get to make the decision to address something or ignore it. As a best practice, I always craft a version that addresses the concerns that my critics have. Sometimes I use it because I think it's better. Other times I scrap it and stick with the original. Or I may blend the two together. As a writer, the decision of what to do is up to me, but I like to give due diligence to the feedback that I receive, whether or not I think it was accurate. Remember, your critics, at least in writing, want to see you succeed. Think about what isn't said. Sometimes things that we thought were strong elements of our story get glossed over. If those elements were designed to pop but didn't, you might have some work to do in thinking about how to get them to do what you intend. Finally, and perhaps most important, don't get upset with the feedback you've received. Remember that the people who are helping you through this process want you to put out the best thing you can. That's why they're helping you in these early drafts. Their feedback comes from a desire to help, and that's an important thing to remember. There are 5 questions you should think about as you review your feedback in preparation for your next draft. First, what portions of your feedback did you find the most helpful? Second, what portions of your feedback do you feel most uncomfortable with? Third, what portions of your story do you need to preserve? Fourth, what portions of your story do you need to change or remove? And finally, how do you intend to make your changes? There is space on pages 69 through 71 of the workbook for you to consider these questions and write down your thoughts before you start that final draft. So what are the goals for this week? Get a couple of good critiques. You can pull some friends or relatives together to help you out. After you've had those critiques, consider your feedback. Don't jump right into writing that final draft. Allow enough time to consider your feedback, usually a couple of days for me at least. And then after that, you can start crafting your next draft. Next Wednesday is going to be our last online program. It's going to cover how to format and submit your work for publication. Until then, happy writing.